Thailand's lush jungles and towering mountains are a backpacker's dream. For years, the stories of secluded trails and remote campsites had lured thrill seekers from all over the world. It was no different for Mia and Liam, a young couple on their gap year. After weeks of traveling through busy cities and golden beaches, they craved peace and quiet. A guidebook had mentioned a trail deep in the northern mountains near Chiang Rai. The locals called it Nam Lai, or the Hidden Vale to the tourists. The trail was said to be breathtaking, but it was rarely visited. When Mia and Liam asked about it at their hostel, the owner, who was a wiry man with weathered skin, immediately shook his head. "That's where the mountain people live," he said in broken English. "Mountain people?" Liam asked, whilst half laughing, assuming it was some sort of local superstition. The owner's face grew serious. "Not safe. Tourists go, but not come back." He gestured with a slicing motion across his neck and walked away, refusing to say more. Mia was skeptical on going, but Liam, who was always the adventurous one, insisted they go anyway. The couple set off early the next morning with their rented motorbike and a map Liam had downloaded onto his phone. The trail began innocently enough. Lush waterfalls and the distant hum of the birds. By mid-afternoon, they found a clearing to set up camp. The sun dipped low, casting shadows that stretched across the dense jungle. As they prepared dinner, a man appeared from the tree line. He was short, dressed in faded, tattered clothes, and his was face smeared with dirt. He had no shoes and carried what looked like a crude machete. "Hello?" Mia said cautiously. The man didn't respond. He just stared at them. Then without a word, he turned and walked back into the forest. "That was weird, right?" Liam muttered, laughing nervously, but Mia wasn't laughing. "We should pack up. Go back to town." Liam waved her off, assuring her it was nothing. "He's probably just a farmer or something." That night, as they lay in their tent, the jungle around them grew eerily quiet. The usual hum of insects and rustling leaves vanished. Then they heard faint whispers in the distance. Mia bolted upright. "Did you hear that?" The whispers were faint but unmistakable, coming from just beyond the tent. They were soft, but you could still hear them. It sounded like the whispers were in a language neither of them understood. "Maybe it's the wind," Liam whispered, even though he didn't believe it himself. The whispers grew louder. Footsteps circled their tent. Then a low, guttural sound which sounded like half a growl, half a laugh. Liam grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. But the forest was empty. "I don't like this, Liam. Let's leave now," Mia said in a panicked voice. Before Liam could respond, something hit the tent. The fabric caved inward as if someone had thrown a rock or struck it with a branch. They scrambled out of the tent, clutching their backpacks. In the dim moonlight, they could see them, shadowy figures lurking just beyond the clearing. Their faces were obscured, and their bodies looked unnatural. There were at least 6 of them. "Run!" Liam yelled. They sprinted down the trail, the beam of Liam's flashlight bouncing wildly. The figures followed their movements. Every time Mia glanced back, they were closer. The figures moved with an animal-like speed. The couple reached the motorbike, and Liam dropped the keys on the floor. Liam managed to start it just as one of the figures emerged from the trees, its face illuminated for the first time. It wasn't quite human. The skin was pale and stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. The eyes were hollow and its mouth hung open. Liam hit the gas and they sped off down the dirt road. Relief washed over them as they drove away on the dirt road, winding towards civilization. But just as they went round a bend, there was a roadblock made of fallen logs. "Stop!" Mia shouted. Liam skidded to a halt, the bike nearly tipping over. More figures emerged from the shadows surrounding them. These were different from the ones in the forest. They looked more human. Their faces looked weathered and grim, and they carried machetes and crude weapons. One of them stepped forward, speaking in a low, distinctive voice. It wasn't Thai, and it wasn't any language they recognized. "What do we do?" Mia whispered. Liam revved the bike, inching forward. The man raised his machete, pointing it at Liam's chest. And then in the distance, the sound of an engine. A pickup truck barreled around the bend, its headlights flooding the scene. The men scattered, disappearing into the jungle. The truck screeched to a halt, and the driver, who was a middle-aged Thai man, jumped out. He waved them over, shouting urgently, "Get in, now!" Without hesitation, Mia and Liam abandoned the bike and climbed into the truck. The man slammed the door and sped off. "You shouldn't be here," he said in broken English. What were those people? Mia asked. The man didn't answer. He just shook his head and muttered something in Thai. When they reached the nearest village, the man dropped them off and drove away without another word. The villagers stared at them as they stumbled into the small cafe. An older woman approached, listening intently as Mia and Liam recounted their story. When they finished, the woman's face was pale. The mountain people, she said quietly. They live deep in the jungle. They take outsiders. You are lucky to escape. Mia and Liam tried to press her for more information, but she simply shook her head and walked away. That night, as they laid in a guest house far from the forest, Mia couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she could those hollow faces, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. I've always prided myself on being independent. Growing up, my dad would take me on long hikes and teach me everything about the wilderness. He taught me how to make a fire, identify edible plants, and navigate without a map in case I got lost. Over the years, I'd camped and hiked more times than I could count, but this trip was different. It was my first solo trip. Just me, my gear, and the wilderness. I knew this would be a test of my skills. I picked a remote part of the state park far from the designated camping spots. The location was near a small and secluded lake. It wasn't on any trails, and that was the appeal to me. I told a friend where I'd be and promised to check in when I got back. Then early Saturday morning, I packed my truck and set out. The drive to the trailhead took about 2 hours. As I pulled up to the dirt road where the trail began, I noticed how quiet it was. There were no other cars around and no signs of life. Just the rustling of leaves in the crisp autumn breeze. It was perfect. So I parked, shouldered my pack, and started hiking. The trail itself was a bit sketchy for the first mile, but then I veered off into the woods following a route I'd marked on my GPS. The terrain was rougher than I expected, but it was manageable. The further I went, the more I felt the tension of daily life slipping away. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was high, and the sight took my breath away. The water was reflecting the vibrant colors of the surrounding trees. Not a single sign of human activity anywhere. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. I set up camp on a flat patch of ground near the lake. My tent went up easily, and I built a small fire pit with stones I found nearby. Once everything was in place, I spent the afternoon fishing. The lake was full of life, and it didn't take long to catch a couple of trout. As the sun dipped lower, I cooked the fish over the fire and ate while watching the sky and its beauty. It was one of those rare moments where everything felt right, like the world has paused just for you. But as the daylight faded, the atmosphere began to change. The forest, which was so inviting during the day, took on a different character at night. The rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a branch seemed louder. I'd camped enough to know the sounds of the forest, but this time something really didn't feel right. I told myself it was just my imagination and it was my mind playing tricks on me. By 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I put a few more logs on the fire, made sure my food was secured, then crawled into my tent. The silence inside was horrible compared to the noise outside. I laid there for a while, just listening to the sounds of the forest until I fell asleep. I don't know what woke me up. One moment I was out like a light, and then suddenly I was wide awake. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard footsteps around my tent. They were slow and heavy, not the quick, light steps of an animal. Someone was definitely outside my tent. My first thought was that it had to be another camper, maybe someone lost or doing the same thing I was doing. But what were the odds of someone stumbling upon my campsite in the middle of nowhere? I reached for the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag, my hands trembling as I gripped it tightly. "Hello," I called out. My voice was shaky but loud enough for anywhere who was there could hear. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. Then I heard the sound of breathing. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire pit wasn't lit anymore, and the moon casting long shadows across the campsite. At first I didn't see anything, but then about 20 feet away from my tent I spotted it. Standing there was a figure standing between two trees. It wasn't moving, just standing there staring right at me. Or at least I thought it was staring. It was too dark to see a face. "Hey!" I shouted, stepping out of the tent with my knife in hand. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. It turned slowly and walked into the woods as if it knew the terrain better than I ever could. I stood there for what felt like hours just scanning the tree line, but it didn't come back. By the time the sun rose, I was ready to get out of there. I packed my gear as fast as I possibly could. I was still feeling uneasy from the night before. I wanted to leave it all behind and just go home. As I stepped onto the trail, something caught my eye at the edge of my campsite. Sticking out of the snow was a small object I hadn't noticed before. I walked over and brushed off the powdery snow off the object. It was a small weathered tin box. I almost left it, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it and inside was a single folded piece of paper. The edges were damp and the writing faded, but still it was still readable. It read, "You were lucky this time." My stomach dropped. I shoved the box back into the snow and left without looking back. Even now I don't know what scares me more. What happened that night or the thought that it might not be over, and whoever or whatever left that note was waiting for me. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a little break from the chaos of everyday life. 4 friends, the outdoors, and a weekend of relaxation. Mark, Sarah, Jason, and Emily found a secluded spot deep in the woods far away from any trails or other campers. It was perfect, or so they thought. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves and distant animal calls. But there was something else in the air that none of them could shake. It wasn't just the usual creepy noises of the woods. They'd been there for a few hours when Mark first noticed it, a shadow moving just beyond the campfire's reach. At first he thought it was an animal or maybe a deer or a bear. But it moved again, faster this time. His stomach twisted. It wasn't any animal he'd ever seen before. Mark said, "Hey, did you guys see that?" The others shrugged it off, dismissing it, thinking it was the wind. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling. He wasn't the only one who felt it either. Jason and Emily were suddenly quieter, their eyes gazing toward the woods. Sarah said, "Relax, it's probably just a raccoon or something." But even Sarah wasn't as confident now. The rustling continued and was getting closer. The noise wasn't the only thing that unsettled them. There was a strange, brutal silence that seemed to settle over the camp. No more wind or insects, just the sound of the crackling fire. Suddenly the rustling was louder, and it felt a lot closer this time. Jason whispered, "Did you hear that?" Before anyone could respond, a loud crash echoed from the woods. "What the hell was that?" Emily said. Mark stood up. His heart was racing. He motioned for the group to stay quiet. Then slowly he grabbed a flashlight from the car and started walking toward the noise. The others were trailing behind. Their flashlights sliced through the darkness, but it barely helped. The woods felt alive, like something was watching them from the shadows. They hadn't gone far when Mark saw it through the trees. It barely visible in the moonlight. Something large was moving. It was tall, hunched with limbs that looked abnormal. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make out the shape. He turned back to the group, his voice was trembling, and said, "We need to go. Now." But before they could turn around, there was a deafening roar from the woods. The creature, whatever it was, let out a horrible sound that made their blood run cold. It was followed by heavy footsteps, getting closer and closer. Jason panicked. "Run! Run!" They didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted back toward the campsite, the sound of the creature's steps echoing behind them. When they reached the car, Mark dropped with the keys due to his hands shaking uncontrollably. Finally, the engine roared to life and they pulled out, the tires kicking up dirt as they sped away from the campsite. The forest sped past them in a blur, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following them. They took a sharp turn, but when they looked back, their worst fear came to life. The creature had emerged from the trees, chasing them down the road. It wasn't running. It looked like it was leaping huge strides, covering ground with terrifying speed. Mark's eyes widened in horror when he realized it was gaining on them. Sarah shouted, "Go faster! Go faster!" Mark slammed the gas pedal to the floor, but it didn't matter. The creature was too fast. Before they could even process what was happening, they heard a sickening thud. "It's on the roof!" Jason screamed. The thing was on the roof of the car. Its claws screeched against the metal, and they could hear its breathing just above their heads. Every time the car swerved or braked, the creature's weight shifted. They knew they couldn't outrun it. Emily said whilst crying, It's going to kill us. We're going to die. The car swerved off the road, narrowly missing a tree. They were losing control, and the creature's weight on top of them was pushing the car down like it was trying to rip through the roof. They had no choice. Mark swerved again, slamming the car into the nearest tree to stop the creature from tearing the car apart. They all scrambled out of the car, tumbling into the woods. The creature didn't follow immediately. It paused whilst perched on top of the car, just watching them with glowing eyes that pierced the darkness. They didn't say much as they walked away from the forest. Adrenaline was coursing through their veins. They'd barely escaped with their lives. But what lingered in their minds wasn't just the creature. It was the feeling that it had been there the whole time, watching them from the shadows. No matter how fast they ran, it always knew where they were. Back in town, they tried to tell people what happened, but no one believed them. The locals just shrugged it off as some wild story or an overactive imagination. They'd all heard the rumors about strange things in the woods, but no one ever took them seriously. To everyone else, it was just another camping tale. But Jason and his friends knew what they saw. Amy and Jason had been looking forward to their camping trip for weeks. They wanted to escape the noise of the city and spend a quiet weekend in nature. They picked a remote spot deep in the woods where there was no cell service and no other campers. Just them and the trees. The first day was peaceful. They set up their tent near a clearing, cooked dinner over the fire, and stayed up late talking under the stars. The air was crisp and the forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But that night, Amy woke to a sound outside the tent. It wasn't the wind or an animal, it was a voice. "Jason," it called, sounding soft and familiar. She froze. Jason was lying right next to her, breathing deeply. He was still asleep. "Jason," the voice called again, but this time it sounded closer. Amy shook Jason to wake him up. Her heart was pounding. "There's someone outside," she whispered. Jason grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to shine the light out into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, but there was no one there. "Probably just the wind," Jason muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. They tried to go back to sleep, but Amy couldn't stop thinking that something was out there watching them. The next day, they hiked through the forest, trying to enjoy the trip despite the unease from the night before. They didn't see any other hikers, which Jason said was a good thing, as it meant they had the place to themselves. But Amy couldn't stop glancing over her shoulder. She was sure she saw movement in her peripheral vision. As the sun began to set, they headed back to camp. They'd almost reached the clearing when they heard it. A distant call which was faint but unmistakable. "Jason! Amy!" They froze. "Who is that?" Amy whispered. Jason didn't answer. He just grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the campsite. They reached the fire pit and spun around while scanning the trees. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, just the sound of their own breathing. "Maybe it's another camper," Jason said, trying to sound confident. But Amy shook her head. "No one else is out here." That night they stayed close to the fire, unwilling to retreat to the flimsy safety of their tent. Around midnight, the voice came again. "Amy! Jason! Help me!" It sounded exactly like Amy's voice. Jason grabbed the hatchet they'd brought for chopping firewood. He barely could hold his hands still due to them shaking. "This isn't funny," he shouted into the trees. "Who's out there?" There was no response. Then from the shadows, something stepped into the clearing. At first glance, it looked like a man, but as it moved closer, Amy realized something was wrong. Its limbs were too long, and its movements jerky and unnatural, like it wasn't used to walking. Its face was eerily blank with an unsettling smile. "Amy," it said in her voice, tilting its head unnaturally. Jason raised the hatch, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it took another step closer, its head twisting unnaturally, as if it were studying them. Amy grabbed Jason's arm. "Run," she whispered. They bolted, leaving the fire in the campsite behind. The creature didn't chase them, well, at least not at first. But as they stumbled through the dark forest, they heard it following them, whilst mimicking their voices. "Help me! Wait! Don't leave!" It said. They didn't stop until they reached their car, which they parked miles away at the trailhead. Jason fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as the creature's voice echoed through the trees, getting closer and closer. Finally, the engine started and they sped down the dirt road, leaving the forest behind. But even as they drove, Amy swore she could still hear it calling their names in her voice, growing fainter as they got farther away. But Amy and Jason couldn't shake what had happened. When they got home, they started digging into what they'd experienced, desperate for answers. That's when they stumbled on stories of skinwalkers, which were basically shapeshifters from Native American folklore. Creatures that could mimic voices and take on human forms. The descriptions matched what they'd seen. It was unsettling, but it made sense. Something had been out there with them,